2022, there was something called a framework agreement, basically talks to bring together civilian leaders and these generals in order to oversee a transition to democracy. That was overseen by the international community, in particular the United States, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the EU. And the genesis of the external involvement and the failure to see Sudan through peace and a democratic transition really has to be understood in that context. It was at that point that I would argue that the failure of achieving a civilian transition occurred, and it was, of course, a result of the machinations of these two generals, but also the lack of foresight with respect to external actors at the time, specifically the lack of inclusion of the very forces and groups and youth and resistance committees and civil society organizations that really were the ones who mobilized for the revolution. So that is really important. That failure of the framework agreement, it was accelerated, it was not inclusive, and of course, as you know, the catalyst for this war began in the context of a contentious issue around merging the militias into the standing army. That, of course, would have led to the lack of autonomy and power of the militia leader who has gone to war against the Sudan Armed Forces, and at the same time, of course, the Sudan Armed Forces, Burhan at its head, was very concerned about having two command and control institutions. In essence, he wanted to control the country. So to answer your question currently about external actors, that is the genesis of their lack of foresight in terms of really supporting the revolution, in my view. And to bring it up to date, the kind of variety of interest, Egypt's interest in and support of the Sudan Armed Forces, the United Arab Emirates support of the militia, and Saudi Arabia's support also of the Sudan Armed Forces has led to this situation where we have up to 3 or 4 different peace initiatives. One in Saudi Arabia, headed by the U.S., one in Djibouti, headed by IGAD, the regional bloc, another headed by the UAE that was recently held in Bahrain. Basically, competing peace initiatives that have obstructed, number one, a resolution to the conflict in terms of implementing a ceasefire, but also motivated these two generals because basically they're utilizing their patrons, whether outside forces, in order to perpetuate the war against the Sudanese people. So I hope that makes sense, but we do have to get back and understand the initial failures of the international community in really implementing a peace agreement that would really satisfy the roots of the problems in Sudan, but most specifically those forces, including resistance committees, young people, civil society organizations that mobilized for the revolution. The reason I mention that is that any resolution to this conflict would require getting back to that and understanding, given that this is a war against the civilian population, the support must be given to the civilian population and immediately be included in any peace initiative that would seek to resolve this conflict.
Professor, on Monday, the French President Emmanuel Macron announced that donors had pledged more than $2 billion to Sudan. He was speaking at an international conference in Paris aimed at increasing humanitarian aid to Sudan.
Even if today there are far too many conflicts, and they are conflicts that are covered more by the press and diplomatic efforts, our duty was to make it clear that we are not forgetting what is happening in Sudan, that we remain mobilized, that there are no double standards. We can announce that more than 2 billion euros will be mobilized for the women and men of Sudan. Before this conference, we had a commitment of 190 million euros. This evening, we are at 2 billion euros for Sudan.
So that's French President Emmanuel Macron at this international conference in Paris. If you can talk also about the role of France, but overall, what the international community can do to be most supportive to ending this war.
Well, of course, it's good news. The priority, of course, is to address the humanitarian crisis. There is absolutely no question about that. The 2 billion euros important. There have been a lot of different initiatives on the part of the United Nations. Very few have met the targets results. And this is one of the reasons Doctors Without Borders has called it a failure of humanity, because of the lack of donor, pledges and support. The 2 billion euros are important, but it's very important to understand that one of the central aspects of this conflict is the way that these two parties are using food delivery and aid delivery as a weapon of war. Not only in terms of targeting aid workers, but also, setting up bureaucratic blockages, refusing permits for aid workers. And the reason I mention that is that 2 billion is extremely important. But the problem is that without a really vigorous political intervention, without understanding that this aid must be really implemented or utilized in the context simultaneously with a vigorous political intervention that seeks to stop the war. And the reason I say that is one of the most important problematics at the moment, as I mentioned, is the lack of coherent coordination on the part of external actors, with France and the EU, of course, pledging this money, Canada and the United States utilizing sanctions against these two generals, but a lack of coordination that would, include civil society organization to set the agenda for a ceasefire and to implement that kind of ceasefire. And also, this kind of pledge, while it's so important, it really does not make up for the destruction of the distributive networks in Sudan. Aid is an absolutely important aspect, but what is happening now is so severe in terms of food insecurity and the famine that the support of local Sudanese, including organizations that were transformed from resistance communities into voluntary association, like emergency response rooms. So what we need is a very vigorous political intervention, coordination between the different actors, and I'm talking about the Gulf countries, the United States, Europe, and African countries. All of them have a stake in this conflict. The reason that this pledge has gone through, one of the reasons is the recognition on the part of external actors, to be quite honest, Amy, that there is not only a huge humanitarian crisis, but the spillover effect across the region, the Red Sea region, the strategic areas that are of such concern to the Gulf countries, to the United States, to Europe, the issue of migration. All of that necessitates a coordinated understanding of the problem or of the intervention, that everyone has a great deal to lose from this conflict. So the pledge is important and very, very important, useful and vital, but without a political coordinated intervention that includes civil society forces and supports local Sudanese organizations like the emergency response rooms, the Darfur Association, and others, we won't really see the restoration of peace.
Professor, I just have one question that maybe you can address briefly. A war of this length obviously requires weapons. Who is supplying the weapons to both sides, and what could be done to put pressure on the arms suppliers of the warring parties?
Well, the problem is that in the Sahel region, in Africa in general, the smuggling of arms is something that is very difficult to control completely. What we call the small arms trade that is really encompasses the entire Sahel region. One of the issues of the arms supplies for the militias has to do previously with the supply of arms that was brought in by United Arab Emirates. That is something that is well known. The Russian Wagner Group also was facilitated arms to the militia. The arms that the Sudan Armed Forces have, of course, number one, has to do with its own stock. It is the Sudan Armed Forces and had received a lot of arms supplies. Recently, as they began to lose the war, particularly after the fall of Jazeera, the central state, they have been getting arms and drones from Iran as a last resort because of the grave situation they find. So we have Gulf countries involved, Iran involved, the small arms trade. That requires, of course, great attention. There have been sanctions implemented against the financing of these arms through the corporations of both the militia leaders and the Sudan Armed Forces, who are supported, I want to add, by extremist Islamists as the only small coalition left to support them. So there is a complex of external actors and of informal trade of arms. That is important to pay attention to, but without really looking at the ways to implement a ceasefire and restore peace, it's just a stopgap kind of policy or intervention. So it is important, but once again, we have to really bring these regional actors into play. The United States, as you know, has finally appointed a special envoy to Sudan, who has, interestingly enough, reiterated much of what I'm saying, and that is that there needs to be a coordination among the regional actors, the ending of arms supplies by certain actors to the different warring parties. And interestingly enough, he has also emphasized the importance of taking civil society seriously. And I would like to also mention that, and this is very key, that he has also mentioned, as the majority of Sudanese have mentioned, despite the severity of this conflict, there is only one solution and only one interest on the part of the majority of Sudanese, 99% of Sudanese, and that is the restoration of full civilian democracy. I know it's counterintuitive. It seems difficult at this stage to think post-war in Sudan, but there is, I think, that even if the American envoy has recognized, as I've said in this program a couple of times, that because of the lack of constituency, the lack of legitimacy, the kind of venal, kind of instrumental, self-interested political and economic objectives of these two warring parties, there is absolutely no other way to resolve this conflict except to support the vast majority of the civilian population and Sudanese inside and outside, and to continue what we call the objectives of what Sudanese call al-Thawra al-Majida, the glorious revolution. That is really the only solution, and this is what even the U.S. envoy has reiterated, and I would argue primarily because he's been talking to Sudanese.
Khalid Mustafa Madani, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Associate